Track limits. Ooh, one thing that every sim racer is afraid of. It's a topic that gets brought up more and more over time. But is it for a good reason or for the bad reason? Well, it all depends on the series you're watching. At least that's what it feels like to me. If you're watching a Formula series like F1, F2, F3, they've been known to only police track limits in very specific parts, and only recently they decided to say, no, we're gonna monitor it all around the circuit. If you're watching GT racing, it's a wide guess if the track limits are policed correctly or not. Some says that you need to leave 2 wheels on the tarmac, others say you need to leave at least half of your car on track. And when it comes to American racing like IndyCar or NASCAR, it's a wild guess if they ever get policed. Now, I'm not gonna act like I know a lot about track limits. If you want a more deep dive into how track limits evolved over time, I suggest checking out Aidan Milward's video on that topic. But what I can talk about is my experience with track limits in a few other simulators, and talk about how each sim and each community that races on it adopts it differently. So you get a bit of an idea of which one, if you're just trying to get into sim racing, which one is the one that you would want to join in for. So let's talk about Assetto Corsa. The game itself has a terrible system by default, which if you cross the line, you get at least 10 or 20 seconds of penalty, and for that duration of time, you cannot touch the throttle because it resets the timer. This is awful for multiple reasons. For one, you're essentially a walking tire wall on track, a walking obstacle on track for 10 seconds minimum. But there are times when it gives you like a 5-second penalty, but those are rare. The game doesn't calculate if you actually gained any time or not during the cut, so many communities just simply turn the entire system off and expect a gentleman's agreement that everyone will use the track limits. Alternatively, there are applications like real penalty or pit lane penalty, but it's once again falling down to gentleman's agreement if these apps are used correctly by the community or the people in the community. In the case of pit lane penalty, which is the one that I use, it's a highly customizable app where you can set up the rules for yourself. You can set it up how much you want to slow down if you go across the track, and how many warnings you want to set up before getting a drive-through. So if it's a community, you might want to sync up those settings, and with real penalty, you need someone to be admin. ACC is, I don't know actually how to describe ACC's penalty system. I see more track cuts deemed okay than not. It does have a warning system built into it, 3 track limits and you get a drive-through, but the limits vary based on classes, I guess, based on categories. Like I said before, when it comes to like British GT racing, they say, at least the last time I saw it, half of the car, otherwise you get a penalty. Well, in ACC, track limits often extend in a way that you can pretty much go over the entire curving sections in some corners. Misano is a perfect example where you can just completely go over the curves, and I'm gonna be honest, I am one who follows the white line as the rule for limits, and that one is just not my cup of tea, let's put it that way. Still, ACC has a solid system that works well for limits, and if you really get a penalty, where you really pushed it. Next up is AMS2 / Project Cars 2. Rest in peace for everyone who still wants to play PC2, because the game by now is gonna be unlisted. But both games have pretty much the same penalty system. You cross the line, if you can guess where it is, and you get a warning. Each server can set up how much warnings can a driver get. It's usually set to 3 or 5. You cross the line, you get a warning, exceed the limit, and you get a penalty. Pretty straightforward. A lot of people give crap about this system, but I think it's not as bad. If you cross the line while overtaking, it can get funky and often give penalties for avoiding accidents, but overall I think AMS2 has more problems than the penalty system, or I should say has bigger problems than the penalty system, so I think it's okay for the time being. It's better than AC's penalty system, but it doesn't really have alternatives, and like I said, AMS2 has more bigger problems than its penalty system. Last on the list is Race Room, and I think Race Room probably has the most critical system. You go over the line, you need to slow down. The game tells you how much you need to slow down, but you can't really cheese it in corners. So more often than not, especially if you use an HUD alternative, you're pretty much kind of forced to just slow down on spot. Now, I do think Race Room's system being critical is a good thing, because it's harder to cheese it, and it pretty much follows my set of rules. Well, when I say my set of rules, the ones that I like to follow, and that is white line is the limit. So if you go fully over the white lines, you gain time, you're gonna get a slowdown penalty. But that's just half of why I think think it's critical. If you ignore the time penalties and just ignore the timer, you actually get a drive-through. Yes, ignoring warnings immediately lands you a drive-through. Now this might sound a bit of a stretch, but from my experience, it actually forces people to stay within limits more. So maybe it's a good thing. I don't know. I kinda like race rooms implementation, but at the same time, I still think it's probably the most critical out of all of them. Don't get me wrong, each sim handles penalties in a different way for track limits. But if I would have to pick one out of the mentioned 4 here, for me it would either be race room or ACC. Then again, it also comes down to the mindsets of people. As I mentioned before, every category in real life probably handles limits differently. And throughout the years, the limits, the track limits themselves have changed a lot. Again, go watch Aiden's video. The problem with track limits and sim racing is that if you turn off the limits, if you turn off the penalties, you kinda have to force a gentleman's agreement for those limits. You need to specify the limits themselves. Is the limit the white line? Is the limit the curbs? Is the limit doesn't matter if you're in a battle? How much do you want people to yield? Do you want to use apps to force the limits? If you use those apps, do you want specific rules or just let people police themselves? I don't think there's an all-in-one solution for track limits. My belief is that white line is the rule. If you go over it too much, you should get a warning. If you exit the warning limit, you should get a drive-through. That's how I race in AC. That's how ACC handles it partially, and that's how race room handles it as well. In the case of AMS2, you just guess it, where's the limit. I would like to think that AMS2 also thinks white line is the rule, but when it comes to like exceeding that white line, it's also a different mindset for each game, each community. Some say 2 wheels, some say 3 wheels, some say half a car. Some people think there needs to be a gentleman's agreement. Some say don't worry about it. Others self-police themselves. And there are people who say if they can do it, I can do it.